Common tongues would not disassociate his household from the vampirism of the previous summer, while the nocturnal comings and goings of the motor trucks provided their share of dark speculation. Local tradesmen spoke of the queerness of the orders brought them by the evil-looking mulatto, and in particular the inordinate amounts of meat and fresh blood secured from the 2 butcher shops in the immediate neighborhood for a household of only 3. These quantities were quite absurd. Then there was the matter of the sounds beneath the earth. Reports that these things were harder to pin down, but all the vague hints tallied in certain basic essentials. Noises of a ritual nature positively existed, and at times, when the bungalow was dark, they might of course have come from the known cellar, but rumor insisted that there were deeper and more spreading crypts. Recalling the ancient tales of Joseph Curwen's catacombs, and assuming for granted that the present bungalow had been selected because of its situation on the old Curwen site, as revealed in one or another of the documents found behind the picture, Willett and Mr. Ward gave this phase of the gossip much attention, and searched many times without success for the door in the riverbank which old manuscripts mentioned. As to popular opinions of the bungalow's various inhabitants, it was soon plain that Brava Portuguese was loathed. The bearded and spectacled Dr. Allen feared, and the pallid young scholar disliked to a profound extent. During the last week or 2, Ward had obviously changed much, abandoning his attempts at affability and speaking only in hoarse but oddly repellent whispers on the few occasions that he ventured forth. Such were the shreds and fragments gathered here and there. And over these Mr. Ward and Dr. Willett held many long and serious conferences. They strove to exercise deduction, induction, and conservative imagination to their utmost extent, and to correlate every known fact of Charles's later life, including the frantic letter which the doctor now showed the father, with the meager documentary evidence available concerning old Joseph Curwen, and they would have given much for a glimpse of the papers Charles had found, for very clearly the key to the youth's madness lay in what he had learned of the ancient wizard and his doing. Part 4. And yet, after all, it was from no step of Mr. Ward's or Dr. Willett's that the next move in this singular case proceeded. The father and the physician, rebuffed and confused by a shallow, too shapeless and intangible to combat, had rested uneasy on their oars, while the typed notes of young Ward to his parents grew fewer and fewer. Then came the first of the month with its customary financial adjustments, and the clerks at certain banks began a peculiar shaking of heads and telephoning from one to another. Officials who knew Charles Ward by sight went down to the bungalow to ask why every check of his appearing at this juncture was a clumsy forgery, and were assured less that they ought to have been, when the youth hoarsely explained that his hand had lately been so much affected by a nervous shock as to make normal writing impossible. He could, he said, form no written characters at all, except with great difficulty, and could prove it by the fact that he had been forced to type all his recent letters. Even those to his father and mother would bear out the assertion. What made the investigators pause in confusion was not this circumstance alone, for that it was nothing unprecedented or fundamentally suspicious, nor even the Pawtuxet gossip of which one or two of them had caught echoes. It was the muddled discourse of the young man which nonplussed them, implying, as it did, a virtual total loss of memory concerning important monetary matters. which he had at his fingertips only a month or two before, something was wrong. For despite the apparent coherence and rationality of his speech, there could be no normal reason for this ill-concealed blankness on vital points. It used to be that the banks took most of the brunt of identity theft, so they were a lot more careful about what they were taking, to the point where, yeah, people could write their own checks, and then there'd be an investigation to whether or not it was forgery because they were sick or something. Moreover, although none of these men knew Ward well, they could not help observing the change in his language and manner. They had heard he was an antiquarian, but even the most hopeless antiquarians do not make use of obsolete phraseology and gestures. Although this combination of hoarseness, palsied hands, bad memory, altered speech, and bearing represented some disturbance or malady of genuine gravity, which no doubt formed the basis of the prevailing odd rumors. And after their departure, the party of officials decided that a talk with the senior ward was imperative. So on the 6th of March, 1928, there was a long and serious conference in Mr. Ward's office, after which the utterly bewildered father summoned Dr. Willett in a kind of helpless resignation. Willett looked over the strained and awkward signatures of the checks and compared them in his mind with the penmanship of the last frantic note. Certainly the change was radical and profound, and yet there was something damnably familiar about the new writing. Possibly recognizing the actual medical condition. It had crabbed and archaic tendencies of a very curious sort and seemed to result from a type of stroke, utterly different from that which the youth had always used. It was strange. But where had he seen it before? On the whole, it was obvious that Charles was insane. Or perhaps had Parkinson's or something. Of that there could be no doubt, and since it appeared unlikely that he could handle this property or continue to deal with the outside world much longer, something must quickly be done toward his oversight and possible cure. It was then that these alienists were called in. Doctors Peck and Waite of Providence, and Dr. Lyman of Boston, to whom Ward and Dr. Willett gave the most exhaustive possible history of the case, and who conferred at length at the now unused library of their young patient, examining what books and papers of his were left in order to gain some further notion of his habitual mental cast. After scanning this material and examining the youth's note to Willett, they all agreed that Charles Ward's studies had been enough to unseat, or at least to warp, any ordinary intellect, and wished most heartily that they could see his more intimate volumes and documents. But this latter they knew they could do, if at all, only after a scene at the bungalow itself. Willett now reviewed the whole case with febrile energy, it being at this time that he obtained the statements of the workmen who had seen Charles find the Kerwin documents, and that he collated the incidents of the destroyed newspaper items, looking up the latter at the journal office. Now, some things I use as reference. I don't have to believe or act out everything I'm seeing in my books or something like that, so I hope people don't come to conclusions like this about my books. It's like, what are we supposed to do about every other Christian? There's some stuff in the Bible. It gets worse than not letting non-Christians in your home, trying to ask the repairman, "You've got to testify of Christianity or I won't let you in," It goes off into some stuff that might think a person's insane. It's like, oh, this person does this. But then again, people have their spiritual choices, even if they go to those ends. I'm not going to necessarily say anybody's insane for it. What now reviewed the whole case with febrile energy, it being at this time that he obtained the statements of the workmen who had seen Charles from the Kerwin documents, and that he collated the incidences of the destroyed newspaper items, looking at the latter at the Journal office. On Thursday, the 8th of March, Doctors Willett, Peck, Lyman, and Waite, accompanied by Mr. Ward, paid the youth their momentous call, making no concealment of their object in questioning the now acknowledged patient with extreme minuteness. Charles, though he was inordinately long in answering the summons, and was still redolent of strange and noxious laboratory odors, when he did finally make his agitated appearance, proved a far from recalcitrant subject, and admitted freely that his memory and balance had suffered somewhat from the close application to abstruse studies. He offered no resistance when his removal to other quarters was insisted upon, and seemed indeed to display a high degree of intelligence, as apart from mere memory. His conduct would have sent his interviewers away in bafflement had not the persistently archaic trend of his speech an unmistakable replacement of modern by ancient ideas in his conscience marked him out as one definitely removed from the normal. Of his work he would say no more to the group of doctors than he had formerly said to his family and to Dr. Willett, and his frantic note of the previous month had dismissed as mere nerves and hysteria. He insisted that this shadowy bungalow possessed no library or laboratory beyond the visible ones, and waxed abstruse and explained the absence from the house such odors as now saturated all his clothing. Well, they now have laundry detergent that takes 3 very good loads to completely remove the smell, so neighborhood gossip he attributed to nothing more than cheap inattentiveness or baffled curiosity. Of whereabouts Dr. Allen, he said, did not feel at liberty to speak definitely, but he assured his visitors that the bearded and spectacled man would return when needed, and paying off the stolid brava who resisted all questioning by the visitors, and enclosing the bungalow, which still seemed to hold such nighted secrets, Ward showed no sign of nervousness save a barely noticed tendency to pause as though listening for something very faint. He was apparently animated by a calm, philosophic resignation, as if his removal were the merest transient incident which would cause the least trouble if facilitated and disposed of once and for all. It was clear that he trusted to his obviously unimpaired keenness of absolute mentality to overcome the embarrassments into which his twisted memory had lost voice and handwriting, and his secretive and eccentric behavior had led him. His mother, it was agreed, was not to be told of the change, his father supplying typed notes in his name. Ward was taken to the restfully and picturesquely situated private hospital maintained by Dr. Waite on Connecticut Island in the bay, and subjected to the closest scrutiny and questioning by all the physicians connected with the case. It was then that the physical oddities were noticed: the slackened metabolism, the altered skin, and the disproportionate neural reactions. Dr. Willett was the most perturbed of the various examiners, for he had attended Ward all his life and could appreciate with terrible keenness the extent of his physical disorganization. Even the familiar olive mark on his hip was gone, while on his chest was a great black mole, or cicatrice, which had never been there before, which made Willett wonder whether the youth had ever submitted to any of the witch markings reputed to be inflicted at certain unwholesome nocturnal meetings in wild and lonely places. Imagine having a birthmark or the remnants of a bite or something, and people think, "Did you witch burn him?" But even if someone is a witch, whatever demon they're making a pact with, that in itself is not really something the state should punish. If we want to convince people and save their souls, punishing that's not really the thing. The doctor could not keep his mind off a certain transcribed witch trial record from Salem which Charles had shown him. in the non-secretive days, which read, Mr. G.B. on that night, put ye devil his mark upon Bridget S., Jonathan A., Simon O., Deliverance W., Joseph C., Susan P., Mahitable C., and Deborah B. Ward's face, too, was troubled horribly, till at length he suddenly discovered why he was horrified. Above the young man's right eye was something which he had never previously noticed, a small scar or pit, precisely like that in the crumbled painting of old Joseph Curwen, and perhaps attesting some hideous ritualistic inoculation, to which both had submitted at a certain stage of their occult careers. While Ward himself was puzzling all the doctors at the hospital, a very strict watch was kept on all mail addressed either to him or to Dr. Allen, which Mr. Ward had ordered delivered at the family house. Let had predicted that very little would be found, since any communications of a vital nature would probably have been exchanged by messenger. But in the latter part of March, there did come a letter from Prague for Dr. Allen, which gave both the doctor and the father deep thought. It was in a very crabbed and archaic hand, and, though clearly not the effort of a foreigner, showed almost as singular a departure from modern English as the speech of young Ward itself. It read, Kleinstrasse 11, Altstadt, Prague, 11th February 1928. Brother in Elmusin Metraton. I, this day, received your mention of what came up from the salts I sent you. I was wrong. That means clearly that ye headstones had been changed. When Barnabas got me the specimen, it is often so, as you must be sensible of the thing you got from ye King's Chapel ground in 1769, and what ye got from old Burry's Point in 1690. That was like to end him. I got such a thing in Egypt 75 years gone, from which came the scar you boys saw on me here in 1924. As I told you long ago, do not call up that which ye cannot put down, either from the dead salts or out of ye spheres beyond. Have ye words for lying all times read, and stop not to be sure when there is any doubt of whom ye have. Stones are all changed now, in 9 grounds out of 10. You are never sure till you question. I this day heard from H., who has had trouble with the soldiers. He is likely to be sorry Transylvania is passed from Hungary to Romania. That would change his seat if the Castrol weren't so futile of what we know. But of this he hath doubtless wrote you. In my next sending there will be somewhat from a little hill tomb from the east that will delight you greatly. Meanwhile, forget not that I am desirous of B.F. if you can possibly get him for me. You know G in Philadelphia better than I. Have him up first, if you will. But do not use him so hard. He will be difficult, for I must speak to him in the end. Jag so thoth neblad zin. Simon O. To Mr. J.C. in Providence. Mr. Ward and Dr. Willett paused in utter chaos before the apparent bit of unrelieved insanity. Only by degrees did they absorb what it seemed to imply. So the absent Dr. Allen and not Charles Ward had come to be the leading spirit at Pawtuxet? That must explain the wild reference and determination in the youth's last frantic letter. And what of this addressing of the bearded and spectacled stranger as Mr. J.C.? There was no escaping the inference, but there are limits to possible monstrosity. Who was Simon O.? The old man Ward had visited Prague 4 years previously, perhaps, but in the centuries behind there had been another Simon O., Simon Orne, alias Jedediah of Salem, who vanished in 1771, and whose peculiar handwriting Dr. Willett now unmistakably recognized from the photostatic copies of the Orne formula, which Charles had at once shown him. What horrors and mysteries, what contradictions and contraventions of nature had come back after a century and a half to harass old Providence with their clustered spires and domes. The father and the old physician, virtually at a loss of what to do or think, went to see Charles at the hospital and questioned him as delicately as they could about Dr. Allen, about the Prague visit, about what he'd learned of Simon or Jedediah Orne of Salem. To all these inquiries the youth was politely noncommittal, merely barking in his hoarse whisper that he had found Dr. Allen to have a remarkable spiritual report with certain sounds from the past, and that any correspondent the bearded man might have in Prague would probably be similarly gifted. When they left, Mr. Ward and Dr. Willett realized to their chagrin that they had really been the ones under catechism, and that, without imparting anything vital himself, the confined youth had adroitly pumped them of everything the Prague letter had contained. Doctors Peck, Waite, and Lyman were not inclined to attach much importance to the strange correspondence of young Ward's companion, for they knew the tendency of kindred eccentrics and monomaniacs to band together, and believed that Charles or Allen had merely unearthed an expatriated counterpart, perhaps one who had seen Orne's handwriting and copied it in an attempt to pose as a bygone character's reincarnation. Allen himself was perhaps a similar case, and many had persuaded the youth into accepting him as an avatar of the long-dead Curwen. Such things had been known before, and on the same basis, the hard-headed doctors disposed of Willet's growing disquiet about Charles Ward's present handwriting, as shown from unpremeditated specimens obtained by various ruses. There's a lot of people that have tried to take on the persona of some reincarnated figure, and to the point where multiple people are trying it at a particular time. And Willett, though he had placed its odd familiarity at last in what it vaguely resembles, was the bygone penmanship of old Joseph Curwen himself. But this the other physicians regarded as a phase of imitativeness only to be expected in a mania of this sort, and refused to grant it by the importance of either favorable or unfavorable. Recognizing this prosaic attitude of his colleagues, Willett advised Mr. Ward to keep to himself the letter which arrived for Dr. Allen on the 2nd of April from Ruckus, Transylvania, in a handwriting so intensely and fundamentally like that of the Hutchinson cipher that both father and physician paused in awe before breaking the seal. This read as follows: Castle Ferenczi, 7th of March, 1929. Castle Ferenczi, 7th of March, 1928. Dear C, had a squad of 20 militia up to talk about what the country folks say. Must dig deeper and have less herd. These Romanians plague one damnably, being obvious and particular, where you could buy a Magyar off with a drink and food. Last month, M got me the sarcophagus of the 5 Sphinxes from ye Acropolis, where he whom I called up said it would be, and I've had 3 talks with what was therein inhumed. It will go to S.O. in Prague directly, and thence to you. It is stubborn, but you know your way with such. You show wisdom in having less about than before, for there was no need to keep the guards in shape and eating off their heads, and it made much to be found in the case of trouble, as you too well know. You can now move and work elsewhere with no killing trouble if needful, though I hope no thing will soon force you to so bothersome a course. I rejoice that you traffic not so much with those outside, for there was ever a mortal peril in it, and you are sensible what it did when you asked protection of one not disposed to give it. You excel me in getting ye formula so another may say them with success. But Borellus fancied it would be so. If just ye right words were had, does ye boy use them often? I regret that he grows squeamish, as I feared he would, when I had him here, night 15 months. But I'm sensible, you know, how to deal with him. You can't say him down with ye formula, for that will work only upon such as ye other formula hath called up from salts. But ye still have strong hands, and knife and pistol, and graves are not hard to dig, nor acids loath to burn. O says you have promised him, B.F., I must have him after B goes to you soon. And may he give you what you wish of that dark thing below Memphis. Employ care in what you call up, and beware of ye boy. It will be ripe in a year's time. To have up ye legions from underneath, and then there are no bounds to what shall be ours. Have confidence in what I say, for you know, and I have had these 150 years more than you to consult these matters in Nephru Kane Hadath. Edward H. For J. Kerwin, Esquire, Providence. But if Willett and Mr. Ward refrained from showing this letter to the alienists, they did not refrain from acting upon it themselves. No amount of learned sophistry could controvert the fact that the strangely bearded and spectacled Dr. Allen, of whom Charles's frantic letter had spoken, such as a monstrous menace, was in close and sinister correspondence with the two inexplicable creatures whom Ward had visited in his travels, and who plainly seemed to be survivals or avatars of Kerwin's old Salem colleagues. That he was regarding himself as the reincarnation of Joseph Kerwin, and that he entertained, or was at least advised to entertain, murderous designs against a boy who could scarcely be other than Charles Ward. There was organized horror afoot, and, no matter who had started it, the missing Allen was by this time at the bottom of it. Therefore, thanking heaven that Charles was now safe in the hospital, Mr. Ward lost no time in engaging detectives to learn all they could of the cryptic, bearded doctor, finding whence he had come, and what Pawtuxet knew of him, and, if possible, discovering his current whereabouts. Now, a person can thank heaven as a metonomial for God. It depends on what one's intentions are, right? Supplying the men with one of the bungalow keys which Charles yielded up, and urged them to explore Allen's vacant room, which had been identified, the patient's belongings had been packed, obtaining what clues they could from any effects he might have left about. Mr. Ward talked with the detectives in his son's old library, and they felt a marked relief when they left at last, for there seemed to hover about the place a vague aura of evil. Perhaps it was they that heard of the infamous old wizard, whose picture had once stared from the paneled overmantel, and perhaps it was something different and irrelevant. But, in any case, they all half sensed an intangible miasma which centered in that carven vestige of an older dwelling, which at times almost rose to the intensity of a material emanation.